Good afternoon and good morning for those of you who are joining us from the West Coast. My name is Lena Guzman. I am the Chief Strategy Officer and Director of Child Trends Hispanic Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's webinar, Learnings and Discussions about a 100-Year Review of Research Focused on Black Families. Those of you who are new to Child Trends, we're the nation's leading research institute focused solely on improving conditions and outcomes for children and families. Our research informs public policy, it builds the evidence base for what works, and highlights data to lift up the experiences of young people and families. Before I get started, just a few housekeeping items. If you have any audio problems, the webinar is set up for participants to dial in, so please do so. If you need technical support, you can use the chat function to contact my colleague, Megan Trinan, who can help you. The webinar will have a Q&A portion towards the end. We recommend that you use the Q&A function rather than using questions or entering your questions in the chat. And we'll be monitoring those and answering them throughout the webinar. So 2 years ago, Child Trends announced its work to build an applied research agenda to expand our knowledge of Black children and families. And as part of that agenda, we hoped to build a deeper understanding of the diversity of Black families, contextualize their experiences within systems and institutions, and produce evidence to inform policies and practices that promote their well-being in the 21st century. But to chart our course forward, we first wanted to understand what had come before. And we wanted to understand the history of research on Black children and families. And so we're pleased to share with you today the results of that endeavor. We're going to start off our webinar with a brief overview of the goals and introduction from Christine Fu from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. My colleague, Chrishana Lloyd, will then be joining. She's one of our lead authors, and she'll be providing an overview of the report. And then we'll hear reactions from our panelists, who include Brenda Jones-Harden from Columbia University School of Social Work, Natalie Williams from the American Public Human Services Association, Shauna Cooper from the Urban Institute and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then we'll turn the discussion open up the discussion where we'll have time to answer your questions. Our goals today are first to discuss how we conducted the 100-year review of research that's focused on Black families, as well as shares lessons learned. We'll discuss implications for those lessons for the research, policy, and programs. And then we're going to open it up, as I mentioned, for conversation and discussion. There's a lot to cover, and we know that we can't do justice to 100 years in 1 hour. So in addition to the webinar, Q&A, Chrishana Lloyd and Sarah Shaw, who is another author of the report, will be hosting 2 office hours, 1 hour each, which will provide additional opportunities for attendees and others to share their thoughts, comments, and pose questions. But first, before I turn over the webinar over to Christine, I just want to take a moment to introduce her. Christine is a Senior Program Officer in Research Evaluation and Learning Unit at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and a proud mom of 2 who enjoys cooking and baking. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has recently begun doing a lot of thinking about issues related to race, equity, and Black families. And Christine will be sharing a little about this with you as a primer for the presentation that we're going to be seeing. So Christine, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lena. It is such a privilege and honor to have been invited to provide some grounding to why this work, the 100-year review of research focused on Black families, is so important. This is a project like no other that I've come across. When I first heard that researchers at Child Trends were looking at the past 100 years of policy, research, and practice focused on Black families, I thought how incredibly groundbreaking this is. This is exactly the kind of work we need more of to transform the current health science knowledge system, to reclaim and reframe research, to focus on what matters most as defined by those who are impacted by the research, and ensure that research frameworks are reflective of the realities, assets, and aspirations of the full diversity of Black families. At the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we believe that we all deserve to live our healthiest life possible. With that in mind, RWJF is working to build upon our culture of health vision through our long-term focus on dismantling structural racism that permeates society with the ambitious goal of building the future we all want for our children and grandchildren. Dismantling structural racism requires reimagining and transforming the systems that greatly impact the lives of children and families in America. This includes, for example, our health system, our tax system, our childcare system, and of course, the health science knowledge system. This seminal report shows us how flawed our understanding is about Black families and charts out steps we, as funders, researchers, and others can take to reshape our understanding about Black families to help them thrive. I look forward to the presentation and discussion. With that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Chrishana Lloyd.
Thank you so much, Christine. Really appreciate your support for this work. I would just like to start off by saying that you cannot conduct an 100-year review of research on Black families without many people being involved. There are lots of folks who've contributed to getting this body of work done. We don't have time to thank them all, so I'm simply listing them here on the slides and acknowledging them. The acknowledgements also in both of the volumes do a really great job of giving you a much broader picture of all of the folks who have contributed to the work, all of the behind the scenes support, if you will. But suffice it to say, this was a huge undertaking. I'd really like to thank my co-authors who are listed here, Mavis Sanders in particular, who led volume 1 and volume 2. And across the team, we spent countless hours just brainstorming, debating, challenging each other, dreaming big, editing the dreams, selecting visual representations of the work, grappling with data inconsistencies, talking to our reviewers, identifying and cataloging resources, and the list goes on. The experiences in creating this were really a microcosm of what we saw occur across the 100 years of work that we researched with other intellectuals and scholars. Also, as we know, and our review makes pretty clear, that resources make all the difference and are critically important if one is to conduct high quality and relevant research. So we'd really like to thank the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, and in particular, Ju Chang, who is the Program Director of Child Wellbeing and a champion and believer in the work, and the Mackenzie Scott Foundation, Mackenzie Scott, and Child Trends, who put in organizational resources to support the work. We can move to the next slide. So before we jump into the meat of the content, I do want to set the stage a little by defining two terms, which are key to this work. One is Black and one is family. And they're really important for interpreting the review learnings and the implications. And as you'll see in this montage in front of you, there are a bunch of families here, a bunch of Black families here. There are different family types, there are different structures, there are people with varying physical characteristics and attributes and such. And you see an adults and children. And our definition of Black families includes an adult or a child in a family that is Black only and or Black and mixed with another race. So in our definition of family, a family must have a child or children either by birth, marriage, adoption, choice. And that could be a child from infancy through adolescence. And a family must at least have a Black family, at least one Black identifying person in that family. And that can be a person who identified as Black alone or in combination with one or more races or ethnicities in their response to the census. I do want to say that we recognize that defining Black, defining family even, is not a value neutral or an apolitical process. But this is who we have defined as Black and family, and this is who we, as we say in the Black community, have invited to the cookout. So much of what we know about Black people and Black families is really based on census data, and so we have drawn on that definition as well. But we know that people have strong feelings about definitions and classifications, and this plays out in many different ways across the years in the review, and even today with some of the new census categories. And that's a longer conversation that we can have. Let's move to the next slide. So I want to talk to you just a little bit about how we did the review, and really want to preface this by saying this is a review of research itself. So not kind of the content of the research, but the actual research process and the ways in which that centered Black families. And so in our review, we examined how research topics were formulated and covered, the methods that were used, who was doing the work, and that includes the institutions and the individuals. And again, just more about the research and not as much about the findings. In volume 1 in particular, we were very interested, intentional, and purposeful about elevating the names of scholars. And to the extent that I can, I will do this throughout our time that we have together in this hour. And primarily because there really was a lack of recognition or acknowledgement of Black scholars historically that continues to happen in present day. Black scholars and intellectuals were relegated to specific publications, journals, and outlets, sometimes newspapers. At times, their voices have been erased and silenced, often in real time, with the elevation of other voices, non-Black voices being very prominent. And so that's problematic on many, many different levels. And so I will try to raise those voices here. And that certainly happened in the review. In line with our work, the review focuses on applied research. And as you'll see here in each chapter, it follows the same format. So there's a decade by decade review, and we cover some common areas, which you see here on the slide. You can go to the next one. We spent a lot of time identifying literature, as you can see here, and we did that using search engines, we did that using websites and various documents. And within those databases, we did kind of keyword searches. We looked for notable scholars, scholars that weren't so notable. We used the language of the time. For example, if we were doing research and looking for literature in the 1930s, we may have used the term Negro instead of African American or Black, right, to yield the best work and the most references and resources. We also did some snowball sampling to really kind of pick up on what was happening in those publications to lead us to others. Next slide. Okay, and then as you see here, we dug into the abstracts and such, and we looked at the methodology of those particular publications, if that was appropriate. In total, we had about 300 actually it's much higher, resources in volume 1 and over 500 for volume 2. And we categorized those and used Zotero. Next. And as you can see here, just a brief example of some shifts that we saw over time to give you a sense of how things changed in terms of language. And this is just in the period of about 30 years. And you can see we moved from Black being used and being most prominent to African American, for example. And we're still playing around with this a little bit, but it does give you a bit of an understanding of the shifts in some of the topics and the language that was used across the years. Next slide. Okay, so there are 3 slides in this section that really speak to some of the current trends and the shifts that are happening with Black families and that have happened from the 1920s to 2020. And I won't have time to go over the content in all of them, but I'd like to at least, talk a little bit about some key findings here. And one, just to ground the conversation a bit, is there are about 46.7 million people in the United States who identify as Black or African American. And that equals about 14% of the population in this country. We have about 42 million who report their race as Black or African American alone, an additional 4.7 million who report their identity as Black or African American in combination with one or more additional races. And so over time, in 2000, in fact, which was about more than 20 years ago, this number was considerably smaller. And it was about 36 million who identified as Black or African American. And what you see is that the growth is notable, right? That 36 million, and now we're looking at about 46.7 million. So a big jump in numbers. That's about a 29% increase. And we think that's in part due to the ability to identify as more than one race in the census, which is an important component and variable when we talk about research and really understanding what's happening with Black families over time, that shift in how people can identify and how they choose to identify. There's some other trends here that you see on the slide: a rise in the different types of Black family structures, from nuclear families to extended families to same-sex families, and an increase in the number of interracial marriages that are occurring. With, as you see here from this visual, the rates of Black men marrying interracially are higher than Black women, and that's been consistent since about the 80s or so, and about double. We can go to the next slide. And then we see here that's an increase in the number of Black immigrants who are coming to the country and living in the country. There are some changes and shifts in religious worship and preferences for younger generations of Black folks. And so we know historically the Black church has really been a bedrock and a strength of the Black community and the Black family. And religiosity is shifting, not necessarily spirituality. So people are still kind of believing in a higher power, but that, going to church and really having that be the center of family life is in fact shifting. And there are varied religious preferences that are shifting and changing, and that's among Black immigrant populations that are in the United States, and also among Black men in particular who may have been incarcerated and who are changing religious preferences, typically moving from Christianity to Muslim in that process. Next slide. There are some changes in residential locations of Black people. We kind of know historically, because of the history of this country and the enslavement of Black people, that Black families have a large presence in the South. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. We know about the Great Migration, and when people were kind of moving out of the southern regions, millions of Black people, in fact, left to head for what they thought would be less racist environments and better educational and employment opportunities, and also where they had family ties. And so people concentrated and settled in particular places: California, Michigan, cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and that's changing now. People are actually moving back to the South. The moves have been led in part by Black professionals, college graduates, and retirees. So you see people with higher incomes and higher levels of resources moving back to the South, sometimes because of family and social and cultural ties, sometimes because of lower cost of living, sometimes to escape the racial upheaval that's happening in cities right now. So there is a shift in the population right now, with, again, the majority of the Black population still being in the South right now. 56%, but don't quote me on that. I don't have my notes in front of me. We also see some increases in home ownership, which is happening across the board for all Americans, but continued residential segregation for Black families living in communities that are primarily Black, with lower levels of wealth in their homes, if they're owning homes, and property values being lower. And we see improved educational attainment over time, over the 100 years, kind of moderate incomes for Black families more generally, and very, very low wealth. Next slide. Okay, so let's jump into the lessons. And there are 4 here. I'm hoping I'll be able to get through all of them, but we shall see. And then we'll open it up for our panelists to discuss. The first lesson here is really that federal, state, and local governments have played a really important role in terms of research and providing funding for research in relationship to Black families. What's important to note here, and what's really critical here, is that those government dollars, while a major source of funding, were also focused on very particular issues, and most often those issues were problem-centered. And so oftentimes too, the way that Black families themselves were viewed as the problem. So you have these kind of research ideologies, these theories, these methods, these practices that were developed and put forth and picked up and popularized in academic outlets, particularly in the earlier years of the review, that were, kind of really part and parcel, predominated by white male sociologists. And so these ideologies were kind of based on a white middle class standard, and that was the norm, that was right. And that was a standard on which to base all families. And so this is problematic for many different ways. in many different reasons and for many different ways. And we can go to slide 2. Which is the next lesson, and that Black scholars have really been critical to kind of dismantling those ideologies and those viewpoints, and really have been critical in the evolving Black family research scene. And so they've not necessarily been the primary influencers of policy discourse, for example, but they have played a key role in really ensuring that there's been attention to systems, which Christine talked about, and that there was kind of a unique focus on Black scholarly contributions within those systems. So despite, having access and limited access to some of those federal dollars, some of those philanthropic dollars that help to seed the examination of Black family issues, challenges, social problems, Black men and women really did that and looked at that from a systematic perspective. And what you see here, even in this picture, this is a picture of Claflin University faculty. They're located in South Carolina, historically Black college and university. And what I love about this particular picture is that there are a mix of folks here. You see Black men, you see Black women, there are Black students here, which speaks to the passing of the baton and the next generation of scholarship that happens. And this is a real critical piece at historically Black colleges and universities and in the field more often, right? That passing of the baton. And when that baton passes, those ideologies, those theories, those methods, the way of thinking also gets passed. So it's a really important lesson to learn, and we'll talk about the implications for that. Next slide. So lesson 3 is really the fact that historically research related to Black families, and that includes government-sponsored research, was often small in scale, specific to certain geographic areas, some of those areas that I named, often cities, and often focused on mothers and families with inadequate income and access to resources. So people who were impoverished. And when you think about where this leads us in terms of how we're operating now in 2024, this is really the crux of the issue. We have theories, we have policies that are really built on a flawed foundation, on theories and policies that are not always relevant to Black families. And that requires a much closer examination of policy, a much closer examination of research when we talk about that passing of the baton, when we talk about how policies are built upon one another, when we talk about and understand how policies really shift that foundation of policies. That's really problematic if the research, the theories, the methods themselves in the earlier years were flawed. So we're kind of living on a not firm foundation and an inaccurate foundation. Okay, next slide. I'll try to wrap this up. And so just in terms of census data, helpful to know that I mentioned earlier that the census is certainly not apolitical. It shifts over time. For example, in the 1920s, we saw categories like white, Black, mulatto, Indian, Chinese, Korean, other. And the enumerator would simply show up to a home and say, oh, this person looks white, I'm going to check the white box. This person looks Black, I'm going to check the Black box. There was no even conversation or self-identification. And that has certainly shifted over time, but really impacts when we think about longitudinal work and really trying to understand who Black families were in the past historically and who they are now, what that means. So we have to not only look at the data that are available, but we also have to look at that implementation process and how they were collected. Next slide. So I'm going to, given the time, I'm going to pass the baton over to the discussants, and then I'm going to loop back as we have the discussion to some of these important takeaways and some of these recommendations, given where we are in the time frame. So I'm going to start off by handing the quote unquote mic over to Dr. Brenda Jones-Harden. And then next you'll hear from, as Lena mentioned, Ms. Natalie Williams, and then Dr. Shauna Cooper. They are a phenomenal group of women. They'll provide brief remarks, about 5 minutes or so, about what they see as important implications for the field, including in research and in practice and in policy. I'm very excited to hear what they have to say because I'm not quite sure what they're going to say, but I know they are dynamo scholars, they are awesome practitioners, and they truly represent the best of the best. So I will hand it over.
All right, that's great. So I have to start by giving kudos to the authors and to Child Trends and the funders. I got to start there for having the foresight to produce this kind of volume. And of course, I have to give a special shout out to the lead author, Chrishana, who was my MSW student at Howard over 3 decades ago. So imagine how proud I am to see her here and to see this volume produced under her leadership. And I just have to say, I feel like this particular volume is going to be one of those that goes down in history as for reading for courses, for researchers, for practitioners who are invested in this work, mostly because of its breadth of content, but its visual beauty. I mean, it's like a coffee table volume. It is so beautiful with those photos. So much to say, but so little time. So let me go on. I think the first thing I want to say is how much I appreciate that this volume has been situated in history. And I hearken back to some of the quotes from W.E. Du Bois. Some of you might remember these, where he talked about historiography and how setting down the record of human action with accuracy and faithfulness of detail can serve the ends of social reform. And I really think this tome has accomplished what Du Bois told us to be thinking about in terms of sociological research all those years ago. So I also very much appreciate the focus on epidemiology. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I am an epi groupie. So I thought starting the chapters with helping us to understand the context, the demographic trends was so important, and helping us think about how they should inform our research questions. For example, the one of the things that came out in the 1980s and beyond that the volume talked about was the mass incarceration of Black men. That helps us to think about not only the structural system and what it means in terms of carceral experiences of Black people, but also helping us to understand Black female-headed households and other things we should be exploring empirically, like non-custodial fathering. The volume talked a lot about fathering. One of the things that I'm really interested in is how to keep that parenting going even when dads are incarcerated. So those kind of epi frames really help us. I also very much appreciated the focus on deficits rather than strengths. I'm often criticized in my own work because I focus primarily on people whom I've worked with as a social work practitioner who contend with a lot of risk, but these 2 volumes point out how important it is for us to focus on the heterogeneity of Black families, most importantly, those strengths. And this business of shouting out Black scholars and bringing them to the fore, I think, is so important, because Black scholars have really pushed the whole field to think about the strengths of Black families, back to, Robert Hill's first book on the strength of Black families. Another thing that I really applaud was the emphasis on multiple modes of data collection. And you all heard Chrishana say that they didn't just look at empirical papers, they went to the gray literature, they did their snowballing methodology. So this kind of focus on all kinds of research, I think, was such an important part of this effort, including their recommendation to capitalize on the voices of Black people, not just the researchers, but research participants themselves to design and interpret research. I really appreciate that, and resonated, even though I'm not a qualitative researcher, but with the qualitative research and how that helped us to understand lots of constructs. I mean, you all think about it, the Dawes studies, the Clark and Clark original Dawes studies, very small studies that led to a spate of quantitative studies in the same arena, which, by the way, are saying the same things that were said back when those original studies were done, which is very unfortunate. But the hope, I think, from this kind of volume is that these smaller studies that they included, that they argued we should have, would inform policy. So going from the ground up instead of just policy informing the research in terms of funding and that kind of thing. So, for example, I was really interested in the employment data, particularly about Black women, and it made me think, somebody should be going out here trying to figure out what these women are doing who are in the gig economy, who are driving Ubers and Lyfts, but also these women who are doing these under the table jobs like still cleaning up houses and still taking care of other people's children, but also doing hair and lashes and all the other things that my kids want to do in their apartment. So that's important. And I know it's impossible to cover everything with this kind of effort, but if it's one thing that I miss, and nobody would be surprised, I'm a developmentalist, was more of a focus on development and how families change because their children change, and parenting changes because children get older. So, I would have loved to have seen more focus on that. And of course, as an early childhood researcher, thinking about what that means, particularly because we know families are most vulnerable then, and how Black families manage this. The other piece that I will say about it, and I have to put this out there, I'm a Head Start groupie, as many of you know who are on this call. So I think about the contribution that Head Start has given, not only to supporting Black families, and by the way, Black families have done a lot to support Head Start as well in terms of being employees and all the parent engagement and advocacy, but also a lot of the research on Black families has come right out of Head Start. With all the funding, that they were really, in my estimation, one of the first real laboratories that really helped us to understand Black family life. And again, not just from this issue of poverty, but from across the board. So maybe your next volumes can review what Black families look like at each of these developmental stages. So I'll just say in sum, it is true, as Chrishana said, that the research has evolved, and scholars are trying to show that Black families, the Black community has evolved as well. So I think that message came across loudly and clearly. One of the most important things that I think has happened in the recent past is a consideration of the role of race and racism in Black family life. I mean, it was a smaller part of the literature then. It is a much larger part of the literature now. We're understanding about racial socialization, all that kind of stuff. So we really have come a long way. We are now finally starting to think about the structural problems that are a result of structural racism, but also poverty, I'll put out there, that really disproportionately affect the Black community. So I hope we can continue to document the heterogeneity in Black family life. I would also hope that we continue to use our voices as researchers to advocate for change for the unfortunately large proportion of Black families who continue to struggle under the burden of policies that contribute to structural racism. So with that, I'm going to hush and turn the baton to Chrishana, I think.
That is fine, and I'm going to pass it right on back. Let's get on that track to Natalie.
Natalie, sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Dr. Jones. That was amazing for just kind of breaking down where you've seen the practice and the field be able to discuss the history of the Black experience, of the Black family, as it relates to the research. When I read the report, I can't deny that I was just so grateful and excited to have this body of work out there, because the reality is that we are in a time when a lot of this work is fading in our communities and in our schools, meaning that our students, even at the elementary, middle school, high school level, history is being rewritten right now. And I have children in Texas schools where I'm reading the context of the history that they are studying, and it's vastly different than what I was taught or brought up with. And so having this line of information that takes us through the history and takes us through a lot of the positive things that have been happening in our communities, but also contributions of Black families in this country and Black people in this country is so important, and it'll be important for future generations. So I'm going to go along with the theme of the positive side of what's happening, and this as a body of work that can help build hope, and hope in multiple sectors. And I'll speak primarily from the human services sector, we don't have the access to the disaggregated data at the community level that we really need to have in order to make decisions. Those decisions will also influence and impact policy that is created. And we don't have the time to do what has been done here as practitioners, which is look at the elongated history of what's happened in our communities, what are the contributions, what are some of the root causes, and what are some of the areas that we need to pay attention to in order to enact policy or to create systems that really help Black families be social and economically mobile. And so this, in a lot of the areas, have been amazing of highlighting and categorizing key areas that I think as practitioners, we would be, it would be terrible for us not to pay attention to or look at. One of the ideas is this idea around Black scholars and the access to the scholarly research from Black scholars from their point of view. Sometimes I feel like we really have to search that out. And in times of making quick decisions, having that information more accessible to help give us a better context of what's happening, I think could be pivotal in how we build human services of the future. And that looks like not only having Black scholars doing the research, but having that research actually published, having it funded, understanding that tenure tracks and knowing who has access to that and who doesn't. Understanding how that research connects to policy implications, whether it's looked at or it's not, and making that a key data point and really verifying if those policy decisions or those policy engagements are founded in something that is based on data from communities that they're meant to serve. So that was one key area that I was excited about because it breaks down not only the history, but we can see how the history has contributed to the present tense. When we look at disparate outcomes in our systems, and they're in every system, the reality is we've been talking about disparity in outcomes for a really long time. And I'll just stop there and pause for people. Why have we not been able to solve for the disparity in outcomes? We've got to get to a place where we can respond to that continued issue, that we also identify that those disparities are deepening. And they're deepening for families in our child welfare system. They're deepening for families in their ability to be social and economically mobile. And they're deepening in our carceral systems. Like everywhere we're seeing them. And there's key groups that continue to face kind of these barriers and these disparate outcomes. So I love the idea of being able to use this research that was so well prepared and well done to be able to look for root cause indicators, not only just what is continuing to keep people in these systems where the outcomes aren't really present, but also what are key highlights of things in communities that we can build on, things that are working, things that help elevate communities from their perspective. The other piece is, how do we allow, as researchers, as institutions, get in a place where we're able to create data systems, but also information and research that is community facing, that can be picked up at many different levels and community can see themselves in this research. And that's one thing that I saw here in the breakdown of the full version, but also the abridged version, is people can pick it up and see, and they can look and see where they are in this study and this research. Overall, I feel like the hope that taking a look back of 100 years up till date is a beautiful thing for our communities. It's something that I wish I would have had early in my scholarship to guide my scholarship through my, not only my, my whole collegiate career. I wish I would have had something like this. Now that I'm looking at it, it's the ability to take this back to our communities or organizations, to have people look at it and say, decisions that we're making that are specifically focused on Black families and Black communities, how does it line up with some of the research that has been developed? Are there ways that we can make decisions that are different? Are there strategies in place that help support what the research is saying could be impactful? And so utilizing it so it doesn't just sit on a shelf, but we're actually activating from this space. And that's really it for me. I just really appreciate this body of work, and I'm grateful for it. And I think I'm passing it on to Shauna.
Thank you, Natalie. I will echo what everyone else has said. First and foremost, that I would like to commend this team for putting together this comprehensive review. So as I sat and read it for the first time, I made several, I still print out hard copies. And so I have several comments to the side of just important points that needed to be made, needed to be included in this comprehensive way. So kudos to this team. So I know that I only have a couple of minutes today, and I have so many things to say about the very layered nature of this report. And so I will try to hit both comments, both in the research sort of area, but also connecting that to policy. And I think that as we think about a 100-year review on research on Black families, understanding the context of how social policy has both shaped what we know, the experiences of Black families in our country, but also how this work has been impacted or has impacted policy and for positive or not so positive ways. So first, I do want to say is, one of the things that I think is one of the primary areas of importance about this review is really the focus on heterogeneity with respect to Black families. And again, thinking about the shared experiences, the shared historical experiences, the shared current experiences, but also understanding the heterogeneity within and across families. In particular, thinking about the experiences of maternal and paternal caregivers, as well as other caregivers, grandparents, community members, and what that means for broader family systems. And again, thinking about some of the work, so I've been reading the chat, so some of this is part of my comments today, but I often read the chat as part of the interaction and interface with folks who are on the call, but also thinking about how we center the voices of Black fathers and Black men as part of sort of this broader context of understanding Black family processes and understanding families as systems, right? So things that impact Black men and Black fathers have implications for everyone else, whether you live in the same household or not, right? And so we talked a little bit about demographic landscape, what that might mean for how families adapt, how they navigate, but also what that means for individual level well-being, family well-being, but also community level well-being. And so also quickly, I will echo the point of thinking about the attention to shifts and reshifts with respect to Black families in the U.S. And so thinking about that with respect to residential shifts. So we see historical areas that are families have moved from, and we see emerging areas where Black families are moving toward. The factors underlying why they decide to move, so economic, better opportunities for families, better educational opportunities, racism, other stressors that might lay the groundwork for the move, but understanding that those shifts are happening and that they have impacts for family processes. And so thinking about, again, we've talked about the wonderful comprehensive review, but also attention to infrastructure support for those who are doing that work. And I think that is particularly important in the context of existing funding disparities among scholars of color, Black scholars in particular. And so I will leave you with very quickly with some points relevant to policy. So how do we translate this work to policy and or programming? I think attention to how we engage in that work is important. So thinking about cultural assets, but also attention to sort of structural level factors and what that means indirectly and directly for children's outcomes, but also outcomes at the family level. Also, I will say is that thinking about sort of the broader context of community engaged methods. How do we think about methodology that reflects life as lived? And how does that work make its way into policy. And I know that we have examples of federal policy initiatives that are integrating culturally engaged, community engaged methods. And again, thinking about centering those voices as part of the research process, and that they are experts of their lived experiences, and understanding what we can gain in the process of doing so, particularly in thinking about innovative policies that are most effective for addressing disparities and inequities and promoting healthy outcomes for Black families. And so the last thing I will say before I get the official hook is really to think about this in the broader context of training. So I've already said that this review I will integrate in my training model of students and other colleagues, but I do think leaving us with the point of thinking about how do we provide training models that allow us to do this work, but also to think about our research questions within the context of policy. My colleagues at Urban Institute have had several initiatives that allowed us to work with scholars, faculty who were at universities across the country to develop, expand their research in ways that are policy relevant, and to develop their questions, to visualize, to package their work in ways that are speaking to current policy issues. And so the very last thing that I will say is money and funding to do and engage that work is important, and thinking about not only to do it at one space and time, but to think about sustaining this work in a way that is transformational for Black scholars who are engaging in this work, but also transformative for Black families, children, and communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the respondents. I would like to loop back to one point, given that we have a few extra minutes. I've done well, which is really, we didn't get to dig into a little bit into the takeaways and recommendations. And I have 3 slides that are really focused on that. And I don't want to spend the time talking. I really would like to hear from folks who are on the webinar, but I do think it's worthwhile to speak to this particular piece. Some of these points have been covered by, our discussants, but I really want to just sit a little bit in this idea about the foundation of what we know about Black families is flawed. And I'm talking really from a policy and a research perspective, which then, informs what we're doing in practice. It informs how resources are allocated. It informs the ideologies around those resources, which we know, and a lot of systems, particularly federal and state ones that are serving Black families, are very punitive. And so it's not just enough to identify that, but what do we do about that, right? And so I think number one, we really do have to acknowledge that these challenges that are embedded in prior research, in research today, right, because of that baton being passed on, are there. We have to acknowledge and understand that that elephant is in the room, and it is shaping everything that we're doing. Until we grapple with that and are really honest about that, we are not going to see fundamental shifts in the way that systems are serving Black families. I think we also, to the point about, kind of Black scholars, and not just Black scholars, other scholars as well, bringing very conceptual and theoretical models and frameworks to the work is also very important, right? There's a different lens that needs to be used to be able to address and tackle some of these issues. And times shift and they change. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, that word cloud will show you we'll be talking about Black families very differently, and we'll be thinking about them differently too. And so we have to, and we must keep up with the times and document the times and document the shifts. To the point of Natalie saying, like, we are seeing some shifts, but we're also seeing some very similar patterns. And the research bears that out, even some of the topics that are covered in the research. So thinking about those conceptual models and frameworks is really important, and doing that embedded in the context of systems, not just looking at families, right, and blaming families for what's happening. I think we really, really need to understand places where people are doing well. Shauna spoke to this. I'm so glad you said it. That's how we learn and grow, right? History teaches us that things have happened. We need to look backward to know how to look forward. And we also need to look at what's working well, for whom and why, right? Because of that heterogeneity, there are a lot of different factors and facets whether it be geography, zip code, access to resources, different family structures and types, systems that are interfacing with people. We have to understand all of that to take those positive lessons learned and apply them in other places within that context. And finally, really research that looks at whole family units. That one slide that I had that really said what we know, a lot of what we know is focused on matrifocal families that are poor in urban areas, sometimes urban areas or rural areas, right? That is not the entirety of who Black families are. And that one little microcosm is not who Black families interface with all the time. I'm sitting here by myself in my household, right, with my husband and my children, and there are such a large number of people who impact my family, that are part of my family, and that are not immediately in this household, right? So we have to do a much better job, I think, of thinking outside of homes, so to speak, to really understand holistic family units in conjunction with the systems. So I will stop there and just open it up to see if there are other questions, points of discussion, comments that folks would like to make in our last few minutes.
Going to elevate a couple of questions that are in the Q&A. From Carol, who's asking specifically Dr. Jones, but I'm sure anyone can respond. Dr. Jones, you mentioned that families are most vulnerable in the early childhood years. Can you please speak a little bit more on that and the factors at play?
Sure. So I'm pushing Chrishana and her team to do a new volume on Black families and young children. So I'll push for that. But just the data, like I'll quote one of my colleagues who say that children are poorest when they are first born. So we know that poverty affects children, larger numbers of children in the early years. We also know that it has its most pernicious effects. And given the high correlation between race and poverty in this country, not so in other countries, but certainly in the US, I'm always pushing for particular attention to those families. So that's what I was really referring to. But I do want to say that I do appreciate this volume's attempt to try and say, which is the truth, that the vulnerable families that I worry about do not depict the entirety of the Black family population. And I think that was one of the best messages that came out of this volume.
I'd like to add, because of that, like one of the things I will say that we struggled with and grappled with a lot was a lack of data, right? And really trying to understand that heterogeneity in Black families. And so Hannah, who just posed one of the questions, and Sarah, who both of whom are authors on the report, and really spent some time digging into and really formulating and crafting those demographic sessions. Hannah, I wonder if you have any ideas or thoughts about what more we might need to know, or some important next steps in terms of the data holes and the deficits in relationship to Black families.
Absolutely. I think that you touched on this a bit in the lessons, but the data itself, these policies historically have been made based on flawed data. And going forward, we need to be very clear and open in the field and say, this is where there are disparities in the data. This is the flawed data that has been used to set these policies. And in future research, in future policy, be very open and honest about the ways in which racism and assumptions and just bad data collection practices have led to a lack of accurate data over time, particularly when it comes to Black families. And the census data in particular has had a lot of flaws that we've uncovered while doing this work. So thank you, Chrishana. There's a lot to say there. And I want to bring it to this question from an anonymous attendee about comparing class distinctions and research on Black families across classes. And please speak on that.
Yeah, I can jump in here. Others should feel free to jump in. I mean, one of the things, a key tenet of this review was really wanting to focus in on and think about Black families in their own right and not in comparison to other families. And I feel really strongly about that. They're not apples to apples comparisons. And so when you talk about this issue related to class, and this, was very evident and clear early on in the review from the 1920s on, that Black scholars in particular were thinking about differences, the heterogeneity, and class was a big piece of that. So that is in the review, and it's still an issue that I think is very much unexplored. Mary Patillo does some great work there. At a University of Chicago. Leslie Ford, who's at Urban Institute, is doing some nice work on middle-class Black families. And what we see in that work is there's not a clear separation or distinction, right? You don't have low-income Black families and middle-income Black families and higher income and wealthy Black families. There's an intertwining of those families and a 0.5 degree of separation, so that even families who might be doing well economically are often reaching back and providing support and resources for other family members who are not doing as well economically, right? And so to understand class for Black families and to understand wealth for Black families, yes, it goes to this point that I made earlier about not looking at single families, but understanding that entirety of the family unit. And so I think our data sets certainly don't allow us to do that. And it also helps us, with better data sets, I think we can understand those assets and those strengths too, right? Like that exchange and that bi-directional relationship there. So there is some work, and I think really good work that has started, and there's a lot more that we could be doing to understand class distinctions and differences among Black families. So thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. We have about 2 minutes left. So I think I'm going to wrap us up. And just to reiterate and note, maybe we can put up the slide with the QR codes. Because we had such a large group, we were really concerned that we might not have an opportunity to get to all of the questions, or people might just want to ask questions in a smaller format, a more intimate way. And so we are providing, as Lena mentioned, office hours. If you want to scan the QR code, we'll send them out with the slides and the recording. You can register for those and just pop in, and we can have some more informal kind of casual conversations about the work or other things, questions you might have, comments, things you might be thinking about in terms of collaboration. I saw a few questions in there about fathers, and we certainly can chat about that. We're doing some work with Dr. Latrice Rollins at the African American Child and Family Center, nationally funded center, who has a very big focus on Black families and Black fathers, and really trying to not duplicate efforts, right? So to understand what's happening in the field, so we're not stepping on each other's toes and we're maximizing resources and collaborating. So I think I will end there, and just by thanking everyone again for their attendance, for their thoughtfulness, the panelists for their participation and remarks, and everyone who contributed to the review. We look forward to sharing out our next steps. We're going to be thinking about putting together some toolkits, some resources, as Shauna mentioned, using in our class, so making things a little bit more readily accessible for people who would like to use the resources in an academic setting. We're thinking about doing more kind of capacity building within communities and extending the research agenda. So thank you all. Appreciate your attendance and look forward to more conversations.